Look at what's happening right now around Shedeur Sanders, because something doesn't add up. For months, we've been told the same story. We've been told that he's overrated. We've been told that he's nothing more than a late-round prospect living off his father's name. We've been told that his confidence is somehow a weakness instead of a strength. And yet, every time someone who has actually played the game at the highest level gets involved in the conversation, the narrative seems to change. That's what makes this latest development so fascinating. A former Super Bowl champion who openly admitted he wasn't sold on Shedeur Sanders has now completely reversed course. Think about how rare that is in modern sports media. Most people double down when they're wrong. Most analysts find excuses. Most critics move the goalposts. But this time, someone actually stepped forward and said, "I got this one wrong." And once that happened, a much bigger question emerged. If experienced football minds continue changing their opinions after taking a closer look at Shedeur Sanders, what exactly are they seeing that so many media personalities appear to be missing? Because the gap between the public narrative and the people closest to the game is becoming impossible to ignore. And the deeper you look into it, the more this story starts revealing uncomfortable truths about how quarterbacks are evaluated in today's football world. For a long time, the criticism surrounding Shedeur Sanders followed a very predictable pattern. Every conversation seemed to begin with the same talking points. Fifth-round pick, questions about leadership, questions about maturity, questions about whether his personality would fit inside a professional locker room. It became such a common theme that many fans stopped questioning where those assumptions were coming from. They simply accepted them because they heard them repeated over and over again. That's the power of a narrative. If enough people say something long enough, eventually it starts sounding like a fact. But narratives become dangerous when they replace actual evaluation, because football doesn't care about narratives. The game only cares about performance. It only cares about preparation. It only cares about whether players can earn the respect of teammates and coaches, and that's where things started becoming interesting. Because while some media voices continued repeating concerns, people who were actually interacting with players inside football environments began describing something very different. Instead of entitlement, they saw professionalism. Instead of distractions, they saw preparation. Instead of character concerns, they saw leadership traits. The disconnect between those two versions of reality has become one of the most fascinating storylines surrounding Shedeur Sanders' football journey. One of the most significant developments came when LeGarrette Blount publicly acknowledged that his opinion had changed. That may not sound groundbreaking on the surface, but anyone familiar with sports culture understands why it matters. Blount isn't just another commentator trying to generate clicks. He's someone who lived through the pressure of professional football. He's someone who understands what winning locker rooms actually look like. He's someone who has been around championship organizations. When a player with that background evaluates another athlete, people listen. What made his comments so powerful wasn't simply that he praised Shedeur. It was the fact that he admitted he originally had concerns. He openly acknowledged that he had heard the same stories everyone else heard. He admitted that he initially bought into some of the narratives circulating around Sanders. But then something happened. He started paying closer attention. He started listening to people inside football environments. He started evaluating the actual player rather than the public perception. And according to Blount, the more information he gathered, the more his original assumptions started falling apart. That's important because it highlights a problem that exists throughout modern sports media. Too many people form opinions before conducting proper evaluations. They create conclusions first and then search for evidence afterward. Blount's willingness to reverse course demonstrated a level of honesty that has become surprisingly rare. What stood out most about his comments wasn't even the football discussion. It was what he said about the locker room. Because at the end of the day, quarterbacks don't succeed simply because they can throw the football. Plenty of talented passers have failed because teammates never fully bought into them. Leadership matters. Respect matters. The ability to unite a locker room matters. According to Blount, one of the biggest revelations was discovering how players around Sanders viewed him. The image being painted publicly didn't match what was happening privately. Instead of describing someone difficult to work with, people inside football circles were describing someone who cared deeply about winning, someone who took preparation seriously, someone who approached the game like a professional. Those aren't minor observations. They're the exact qualities organizations search for when evaluating quarterbacks. Fans often become obsessed with measurable traits like arm strength and athleticism, but coaches constantly emphasize intangibles. They want players who elevate teammates. They want players who command respect. They want players who create belief inside the locker room. And according to people who have spent time evaluating Sanders closely, those qualities appear to be present. What's fascinating is how different the conversation becomes when former players get involved. Former players often view the game through a completely different lens than media analysts. They understand how much happens behind the scenes. They understand that leadership isn't always visible to outsiders. They understand that preparation can matter just as much as talent. That's why so many former athletes hesitate to make sweeping judgments about young quarterbacks. They know there are factors the public never sees: meeting room habits, practice habits, relationships with teammates, responses to adversity. All of those things influence a player's future, and that's precisely why Blount's comments carried so much weight. He wasn't speaking from a place of speculation. He was speaking from experience. He recognized qualities that successful players tend to recognize in one another. And when someone with championship experience starts praising a young quarterback's mindset, people pay attention. The timing of all this makes the story even more interesting, because while Blount was publicly changing his opinion, reports from inside football circles continued moving in the same direction. Coaches kept mentioning development. Teammates kept mentioning professionalism. Evaluators kept mentioning growth. Piece by piece, a different picture started emerging. Not a picture of a player who had everything figured out, not a picture of a finished product, but a picture of someone steadily improving, someone taking coaching seriously, someone investing significant effort into becoming better. That's an important distinction. Too many football discussions become trapped in extremes. A player is either a future superstar or a complete bust. Reality rarely works that way. Development is a process. Growth happens gradually. Most successful quarterbacks improve over time rather than arriving fully formed. And according to the people closest to the situation, that's exactly what appears to be happening with Sanders. But perhaps the most important aspect of this entire discussion involves accountability, because what Blount did was something many critics refused to do. He updated his evaluation when new information became available. That's how honest analysis is supposed to work. You gather evidence, you make observations, and if the facts change, your conclusions should change as well. Instead, many commentators become emotionally attached to their original takes. They spend so much time defending previous opinions that they stop evaluating the current reality. That's why some fans have become increasingly frustrated with portions of the media coverage surrounding Sanders. They don't necessarily expect everyone to become supporters. They simply want evaluations that evolve as circumstances evolve. If a player improves, acknowledge it. If a player earns praise from respected football minds, discuss it. If a player demonstrates growth, incorporate that information into the conversation. That isn't favoritism. That's simply honest analysis. And that's where the story takes an even more interesting turn, because while former players were beginning to reassess Sanders, another group of people was reaching remarkably similar conclusions. The coaches, the people responsible for developing quarterbacks every single day, the people whose careers depend on accurately evaluating talent. Their comments would soon create an even bigger challenge for the critics. Because once coaches started speaking publicly about what they were seeing from Shedeur Sanders, the gap between perception and reality became larger than ever before. And what they revealed would completely change the direction of the conversation. The coaches may have created the biggest problem, yet for the people who continue insisting that Shedeur Sanders hasn't shown anything. Because when coaches speak publicly about quarterbacks, especially young quarterbacks, every word matters. These are people whose livelihoods depend on accurately evaluating talent. They don't hand out praise because they like a player. They don't compliment quarterbacks to make fans happy. They do it because they see something worth acknowledging. That's why the comments coming out of Cleveland have generated so much attention. Again and again, the message has been surprisingly consistent. Development, improvement, growth. Those aren't accidental words. They're football words. They're the terms coaches use when a player is doing exactly what he's supposed to be doing behind the scenes. And the more those comments started piling up, the harder it became to reconcile them with the narrative that Sanders was somehow failing to impress the people around him. Because if coaches are seeing progress every day, what exactly are critics watching? One of the biggest misconceptions fans have about quarterback development is believing that everything revolves around game statistics. Statistics matter, of course, nobody is denying that, but coaches often focus on completely different indicators when evaluating young players. They pay attention to footwork, timing, decision-making, understanding protections, processing information, command of the huddle, communication skills. These are the things that determine whether a quarterback can eventually succeed at the professional level. Many of them never show up on a box score. A quarterback can throw for 300 yards and still make mistakes that frustrate coaches. Another quarterback can produce average statistics while demonstrating significant developmental progress. That's why the people inside NFL buildings often sound very different from the people outside them. They're evaluating different things. And according to multiple reports surrounding Sanders, the areas coaches care about most have been steadily improving. Think about what it means when a coaching staff repeatedly mentions progress. Coaches spend countless hours watching film. They analyze every throw, every drop back, every decision. They compare players against previous performances. They identify weaknesses and then track whether those weaknesses improve. Development isn't measured in dramatic overnight transformations. It's measured through small improvements repeated consistently over time. A quarterback learns to identify defenses more quickly. He improves his mechanics. He becomes more comfortable within the offense. He processes information faster. Individually, those changes might seem minor. Collectively, they can completely alter a player's trajectory. That's why positive comments from coaches often carry more significance than people realize. They're not reacting to a single highlight. They're observing an ongoing process. And in Sanders' case, the people closest to that process appear encouraged by what they're seeing. What makes the situation even more fascinating is the timing, because while positive evaluations continued emerging from inside football circles, the public debate seemed stuck in the exact same place. Critics kept returning to the same talking points. Fifth-round pick, questions about expectations, questions about whether he should be viewed as a future starter, questions about whether the hype was getting ahead of reality. In some ways, it felt like two entirely different conversations were taking place. One conversation focused on development, the other focused on labels. One side was discussing growth, the other was discussing draft position. And that's where many supporters believe the disconnect began. Because while draft status is relevant, it isn't destiny. History has proven that repeatedly. Every NFL season produces examples of players outperforming where they were selected. Some of the league's greatest success stories involve athletes who exceeded expectations after entering the league with limited fanfare. That's one reason the fifth-round discussion has become such a lightning rod. Critics often mention it as if it's a final verdict. Supporters see it as nothing more than a starting point. The truth probably exists somewhere in the middle. Draft position absolutely influences opportunities. Teams invest more heavily in higher selections. They often receive more chances to succeed, but eventually, performance becomes the deciding factor. Once a player enters the building, coaches evaluate what they actually see. They don't care where someone was drafted nearly as much as fans think they do. They care about whether a player can help them win. That's the universal language of football. Production earns opportunities. Improvement earns trust. And according to the people responsible for evaluating Sanders every day, he has been earning both. Another fascinating aspect of this story involves expectations. Expectations can be incredibly powerful in sports. Sometimes they elevate players, sometimes they become obstacles. From the moment Sanders entered the football spotlight, expectations followed him everywhere. Some believed he would become a star. Others were determined to prove he couldn't live up to the hype. Very few people occupied the middle ground. That's what happens when a player carries a famous last name and attracts significant attention. Every success becomes amplified. Every mistake becomes magnified. Every development becomes a headline. Most quarterbacks don't enter the league carrying that level of scrutiny. Sanders did, and whether fair or unfair, it has shaped nearly every conversation surrounding his career. What's remarkable is that despite all the attention, much of the feedback coming from teammates and coaches has centered on professionalism. That's not the description many critics expected to hear. Professionalism isn't flashy, it isn't controversial, it doesn't generate viral headlines, but inside NFL organizations, it's one of the most valuable compliments a player can receive. Professional players prepare, professional players study, professional players take coaching seriously. Professional players understand that talent alone isn't enough. If multiple people inside football environments continue describing Sanders in those terms, that's meaningful information. It's the kind of information that should influence evaluations. Yet for some critics, it doesn't seem to matter. The original narrative remains unchanged regardless of new evidence. And that's where the debate starts becoming less about football and more about perception. Because at some point, people have to decide what evidence they're willing to accept. If former players praise a quarterback, does it matter? If coaches praise a quarterback, does it matter? If teammates praise a quarterback, does it matter? Or are evaluations going to remain frozen in place regardless of what happens? Those questions are becoming increasingly important because the conversation surrounding Sanders continues evolving. More voices are entering the discussion. More football people are sharing their observations, and not all of them align with the narrative many fans were originally told. Perhaps the most interesting development is that even some former skeptics appear to be reconsidering their positions. That's usually a sign that something real is happening. People rarely change their opinions without a reason, especially in sports, where public takes often become part of someone's professional identity. Admitting you were wrong isn't easy. It requires humility. It requires honesty. It requires a willingness to prioritize reality over ego. That's why the growing number of positive evaluations surrounding Sanders has attracted so much attention. It's not coming from one person. It's not coming from one isolated source. It's emerging from multiple directions simultaneously. Former players, coaches, people with direct access to the situation. All of them seem to be noticing similar things. While the football evaluations were becoming more positive, another battle was quietly unfolding in the background. A battle over perception, a battle over image, a battle over what leadership is supposed to look like. Because for some observers, the discussion was never solely about football ability. It was about personality. It was about confidence. It was about whether a player who carries himself the way Shedeur Sanders does fits the traditional mold many people expect from a quarterback. And once that conversation entered the spotlight, the debate became far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Because what some people viewed as confidence, others viewed very differently. And that disagreement would soon become one of the biggest storylines surrounding his future. The moment a conversation shifts from football performance to personality, things become far more complicated. Statistics can be measured, film can be reviewed, wins and losses can be counted. Personality, however, exists in the eye of the beholder. One person sees confidence, another sees arrogance. One person sees leadership, another sees self-promotion. And nowhere has that divide become more obvious than in the public discussion surrounding Shedeur Sanders. For years, people have debated not just what kind of quarterback he is, but what kind of person he is. What's fascinating is that many of the same traits drawing criticism from outsiders are being praised by people who actually understand what it takes to lead a football team. That's where the entire conversation starts becoming difficult to ignore. Because if former players, coaches, and teammates consistently describe Sanders as professional, prepared, and respected, why do some public narratives continue painting a completely different picture? The answer may have less to do with football and more to do with expectations. The reality is that quarterbacks have always been judged differently than other athletes. Fair or unfair, they are expected to fit a certain mold. People want them to speak a certain way, act a certain way, present themselves a certain way. When someone steps outside that traditional framework, reactions can become intense. Sanders has never tried to hide who he is. He carries confidence. He embraces attention. He doesn't apologize for believing in himself. To some observers, those qualities are signs of leadership. To others, they become reasons for criticism. That's why the conversation surrounding him often feels so different from discussions about other young quarterbacks. People aren't just evaluating his throws, they're evaluating his image. And image is one of the most subjective things in sports. Two people can watch the exact same interview and reach completely opposite conclusions. One sees a future leader. The other sees someone who hasn't earned the spotlight yet. What's interesting is that many former players seem far less concerned about these issues than media personalities are. That's because players understand something fans often overlook. Locker rooms don't care about public narratives nearly as much as people think. Teammates care about effort, preparation, accountability, trust. If a player shows up, works hard, and helps the team win, most other concerns disappear quickly. That's why endorsements from former players carry so much weight. They understand what matters once the cameras stop rolling. They understand that confidence isn't automatically a negative trait. In fact, confidence is often necessary for success. Quarterbacks are expected to stand in front of an entire team and convince everyone that they can win. That's difficult to do if you don't genuinely believe in yourself. The best leaders in sports history almost always possessed strong confidence. The difference is that fans tend to celebrate confidence after success arrives, while criticizing it before success is fully established. This is where the debate surrounding Sanders becomes especially revealing. Many of the criticisms aimed at him aren't based on something he has done. They're based on assumptions about how a confident young athlete should be perceived. Supporters argue that he is being judged for traits that would be celebrated if he were producing at an elite level on Sundays. Critics argue that confidence must be earned through accomplishments. Both perspectives exist, but the reality is that the conversation often becomes emotional rather than objective. That's why every positive report seems to create such strong reactions. For supporters, it validates what they've believed all along. For critics, it challenges assumptions they've already made. And once people become emotionally invested in a narrative, changing their minds becomes difficult. Then there's another layer that many people believe influences the entire discussion: the Sanders name itself. Whether fair or unfair, Shedeur entered football carrying one of the most recognizable surnames in sports history. Deion Sanders has spent decades attracting attention. He built a Hall of Fame career while embracing confidence, style, and visibility. Some people admire that approach. Others have spent years criticizing it. As a result, Shedeur entered the spotlight under circumstances few athletes ever experience. Before he threw a professional pass, people already had opinions. Before they evaluated him independently, they often viewed him through the lens of his father's reputation. That's not speculation. It's simply the reality of being connected to one of the biggest personalities sports has ever seen. Shedeur himself has hinted at this dynamic. He has suggested that some criticism directed toward him may actually reflect opinions people already hold about his father. Whether that's entirely true is impossible to prove, but it's easy to understand why the idea resonates with so many supporters. Because the intensity of some reactions has always seemed unusual. Young quarterbacks are criticized all the time, but the level of attention surrounding Sanders often feels different. Every quote becomes a headline. Every social media post becomes a discussion. Every public appearance generates debate. That level of scrutiny rarely happens without larger forces at work, and the Sanders family name undeniably creates those forces. Yet despite all the noise, something important keeps happening. The football conversation continues moving forward. Coaches keep evaluating, teammates keep observing, former players keep sharing their opinions, and increasingly, those opinions appear more positive than negative. That's significant because eventually football has a way of cutting through narratives. Public perception can only dominate the conversation for so long. Eventually, performance becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, coaches make decisions based on what they see. Eventually, organizations invest in players they believe can help them win. That's where the next stage of this story becomes so important. Training camp is approaching, and training camp changes everything. Off-season discussions are built on reports, observations, and projections. Training camp introduces direct competition. Every rep becomes meaningful. Every mistake becomes more noticeable. Every success carries more weight. It's the point where opinions begin colliding with reality. For Sanders, That means an opportunity to continue building momentum. For critics, it means a chance to see whether their concerns are justified. For coaches, it means gathering the information necessary to make difficult decisions. Most importantly, it means the conversation will finally start shifting away from speculation and toward evidence. What's remarkable is how much the narrative has already changed. Not long ago, discussions about Sanders focused almost entirely on doubt. Questions about whether he belonged. Questions about whether he could handle professional football. Questions about whether the hype exceeded the talent. Today, the conversation looks different. Those questions still exist, but they're being joined by new ones. Could he compete for a bigger role than expected? Could his development be happening faster than critics predicted? Could the people inside football environments actually be seeing something significant? Those are very different conversations, and the fact that they're happening at all represents a major shift in perception. At the end of the day, this entire story comes down to one simple idea. Reality eventually wins. Narratives are powerful, but they don't last forever. Public opinion can influence conversations, but it can't change what happens on the field. If Sanders continues developing, people will notice. If he earns opportunities, people will notice. If coaches and teammates continue supporting him, people will notice. That's the beauty of sports. The truth eventually reveals itself. Not through debates, not through hot takes, not through social media arguments, through performance. And that's why the next few months may be the most important stretch of Shedeur Sanders' football career so far. Not because every question will be answered immediately, but because the answers will finally start coming. The critics will have their evidence. The supporters will have their evidence. The coaches will make their evaluations. And somewhere within that process, the reality of who Shedeur Sanders truly is as a quarterback will become much clearer. For now, the conversation continues. Former players are changing their minds. Coaches are praising development. Supporters are growing more confident. Critics remain skeptical. But one thing has become impossible to ignore. The people closest to football seem far more optimistic about Shedeur Sanders than many of the people talking about him from a distance. And if that trend continues, the biggest surprise won't be that Sanders succeeds. The biggest surprise may be how many people failed to see it coming.